Supreme Court rules on a landmark case challenging prayer at town hall meetings. Our Jason Calvi is there. A terrorist group now claims responsibility for the disappearance of teenage schoolgirls in Nigeria. As the UN hammers the Vatican about its handling of sex abuse, a special commission addressing the issue wraps up its meetings at the Vatican. And Italy's March for Life draws tens of thousands of pro-lifers to Rome. Those stories and much more just ahead on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, May 5th, 2014. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with the EWTN News Nightly team. Looking at news now, the Supreme Court makes a landmark decision on prayer at town hall meetings, and it could impact towns and cities where you and I live. Our Jason Calvi has been watching this story closely. He's at the High Court tonight with more on this case. Jason, what did the justices decide today?
Brian, the prayers will continue. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 ruling today, said that prayers before government meetings are allowed and that people can pray according to the dictates of their own conscience. Now, this case comes to us from upstate New York in the town of Greece, but the ramifications of today's ruling could apply to cities and towns across the country.
Lord God of all creation, we give you thanks and praise.
These prayers will go on at town hall meetings. Justice Kennedy wrote the majority opinion. He says the prayers are ceremonial and they keep with our nation's history.
Amen.
Today's ruling is a defeat for Greece, New York residents Susan Galloway, who's Jewish, and Linda Stevens, an atheist. In their lawsuit, they claimed the town was violating the Constitution's Establishment Clause. That's because most of the prayers are Christian.
The Lord bless them for their commitment.
A question for the court. Is the town forcing people to practice a religion? Kennedy says no. People are free to ignore the prayers. Kennedy also argues that the government can't dictate that legislative prayer be generic. He wrote, "The court could not seek to require ministers to set aside their nuanced and deeply personal beliefs for vague and artificial ones." Americans United for Separation of Church and State represented the two residents. They condemned today's ruling. The group said all who attend government meetings could be subjected to the religion of the majority. In the dissent, Justice Kagan says, "I think the town of Greece's prayer practices violate that norm of religious equality. Our public institutions belong no less to the Buddhist or Hindu than to the Methodist or Episcopalian." The High Court's ruling says town officials do need to make a good faith effort at being inclusive of all religions. The ruling doesn't allow for every kind of prayer. Ones that threaten damnation or attack non-believers are not included.
And Alliance Defending Freedom, they're the group that represents the town of Greece. They say that they're going to let cities and towns across the country know of today's ruling, that they have the freedom to pray.
Jason, does this ruling have any impact on school prayer?
Brian, there's not any, this case only deals with that one issue of legislative prayer before government meetings.
All right, Jason Calvi at the Supreme Court tonight. Thank you. Now some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. Some very frightening news for the parents of nearly 300 kidnapped Nigerian schoolgirls. The leader of the terrorist organization Boko Haram claims he kidnapped the girls and plans to sell them. Our Wyatt Spencer has been watching this story, joining us now with details. Wyatt?
Brian, today the leader of Boko Haram threatened more attacks and threatened to abduct more girls. He's calling the girls he's captured slaves and says, quote, "I will sell them in the marketplace," a nightmare for the families of those abducted girls.
A desperate plea for their release, but if it is Boko Haram who took the girls, it doesn't look like it's going to be easy for relatives in northern Nigeria to get them back. Protesters say the government is not doing enough to find them.
They are not doing anything up to now. They've been promising us that these girls will be found, but up to today, up to this moment I am talking, nothing has been done. No single military security personnel has gone to that bush to look for these girls, as I am talking now.
Nigeria's police confirm more than 300 girls were abducted from their school in Chibok back on April 14th. 53 escaped, but 276 are still captured. The suspects, Boko Haram, have been accused of several car bombings in the last 3 weeks. Their name roughly translates to "Western education is sinful." Their goal is to stop or kill anyone who does not agree with their goal of an Islamic state. Protesters have accused President Goodluck Jonathan of being insensitive to the girls' plight, which he denies.
Till today, The security personnel have been searching everywhere, and we believe that wherever these girls are, we'll get them out. What we request is maximum cooperation from the guardians and the parents of these girls, because up to this time, they've not been able to come clearly to give the police clear identity of the girls that are yet to return.
This week, Nigeria's capital, Abuja, is set to host a World Economic Forum, but for so many, the threat of terrorism and missing girls is casting a cloud over the event. Secretary of State John Kerry vowed the U.S. will help Nigerian officials in their search, and that will likely come in foreign aid and intelligence. Brian.
All right, thank you, Wyatt. Dr. Amy Pate joins us now. She's a senior researcher at the University of Maryland's Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. She was done a great deal of field work in Nigeria, specializing in ethnic politics. Dr. Pate, what is the situation there in Nigeria where something like this could actually happen?
Well, northern Nigeria, where Boko Haram has its stronghold, is chronically underdeveloped. There's not a huge amount of state presence there. Parts of it are fairly sparsely populated. And there's also a history of tension between the Muslim north and the Christian south. And right now, the president of Nigeria is a Christian and is going against a tradition of alternating between Muslim and Christian in that presidency, which also heightens tension as well.
So we've been told that these girls are going to be sold. This is human trafficking. Mm-hmm. Is there a direct link between terrorism in this part of the world and human trafficking?
There's certainly been cases of it before, although the scale of this with over 200 girls abducted is quite unusual. Usually it's much smaller numbers of girls. Also young boys are also kidnapped and used for child soldiers. The only other case that I know of that reaches this scale was the Lord's Resistance Army in 1996 abducted about 140 girls from a Catholic boarding school, although a nun was able to negotiate the release of most of them. But the scale of this is really unprecedented.
And it's especially troubling in the sense that in the video that was released claiming responsibility, apparently the leader of Boko Haram said that some of these girls, Christians, are being forced to convert to Islam.
Yes, I mean, this part of Nigeria is overwhelmingly Muslim, so the percentage of girls who are kidnapped who are Christian was quite small, but that would be something that would be expected, that they're going to be sold most likely into marriage, perhaps a marriage to militants, and they would be expected to convert.
What is being done to find these girls that you know of? Is there enough being done?
So there's a lot of distrust of the military and the police in the area. The military and the police have both been accused of sort of very egregious human rights abuses as they go after Boko Haram militants. I've heard that some parents and families are collaborating with local hunters and trackers to try to hunt down where the location of their daughters, where they may be being held. There's talks that some of them have already been moved out of the country. So Nigeria is also working with the Cameroonian authorities, especially to see if they can help. But it's very hard to coordinate on the ground. And there's fear that Boko Haram has infiltrated both military units and police units in this part of Nigeria, which makes it even more difficult.
Very frightening. Dr. Amy Pate, thank you for joining us with your insight tonight. Well, more violence in Ukraine. Several officers are dead and dozens wounded in gun battles with pro-Russian militants. That's according to Ukraine's interior minister. The violent confrontation took place in the eastern city of Slavyansk. It's at the heart of the uprising in East Ukraine against the central government in Kiev. Witnesses report gunfire and multiple explosions in and around this city of 125,000. In another strategic move, the Ukraine government reportedly sent an elite National Guard unit to reestablish control in the southern port city of Odessa. The twin moves reflect an apparent escalation of efforts to bring this region back under Kiev's control. Tragic news further east in Afghanistan. People living in a village are searching for survivors of a landslide that killed hundreds of people. Around 700 families have been displaced by the torrent of mud that swept through their village. Afghan President Hamid Karzai designated Sunday as a day of mourning for the hundreds who died. Authorities still don't have an exact figure on how many people perished, but estimates have ranged from 250 to nearly 3,000. A strong earthquake shook northern Thailand and Myanmar this morning, smashing windows, cracking walls and roads, and damaging Buddhist temples. A shopping mall in northern Thailand was evacuated after the 6.0 magnitude earthquake began to shake the building. No casualties have been reported. Well, it's an annual black tie evening here in Washington that leaves everybody, including the president, laughing usually at themselves. Journalists, politicians, and media personalities rub shoulders at the White House Correspondents Association dinner. On Saturday, the host, actor, and comedian Joel McHale took a few jabs at the audience. President Obama also had some one-liners, even about his own health care rollout.
In 2008, my slogan was, "Yes, we can." In 2013, my slogan was, "Control, Alt, Delete."
This celebrity-packed annual dinner helps raise money for college scholarships. Coming up, the Vatican Commission on Abuse wraps up its meetings, and the UN continues grilling the Vatican about sex abuse. We have expert analysis tonight. Also, Pope Francis celebrates a massive Thanksgiving for the canonization of Pope St. John Paul II at the Polish National Church in Rome. Good to have you with us for EWTN News Nightly tonight, and the Vatican is in the hot seat today. The UN is comparing the Vatican's handling of the priest sex abuse scandal with torture. Our Alan Holdren has more from Rome. Alan?
So, Brian, up in Geneva, Switzerland today, a Holy See delegation gave a presentation to the UN's Committee on the Convention Against Torture. Now, this Holy See delegation is led by Archbishop Silvano Tomasi, and he told the convention that the Holy See is doing everything it possibly can to work against violence and torture, both within the Vatican City-State and in the rest of the world. He said that in the Vatican City-State, currently all measures are in place against violence and torture, whereas in the rest of the world, the Holy See does what it can to lend moral support and also collaboration to other members of the international community. Now, this committee shouldn't be confused with the Vatican's new Commission for the Protection of Minors. Now, this commission was also meeting for the first time last week. They came up with their initial conclusions, which they presented on Saturday, and they said that they're focusing in particular on accountability and transparency when dealing with sex abuse.
Abuse is constantly a concern for bishops, for religious, for all Catholic institutions, and we do with all our resources to make the world and the church a safer place for children.
We're going to be trying to understand the processes which are in place at the moment and considering whether they can be made stronger and how they can be made stronger, so that we can advise the appropriate dicasteries and the Pope. Our advice is directly to the Holy Father.
So as you can see, this commission has a mission. What it doesn't have yet are its founding documents, its statutes. They're going to be coming up with those in the coming months. One thing that they did say during this press conference was that they won't be treating individual cases of sex abuse. What they will be giving is recommendations both within the Vatican and outside of the Vatican of best practices and policies to put in practice. Back to you in Washington, Brian.
All right, thank you. Alan Holdren, our Rome correspondent. We have Maureen Ferguson now of the Catholic Association with us. Maureen, this new Commission for the Protection of Minors just wrapping up its first set of meetings. How significant is this commission and the work it's doing?
Well, of course, Pope Francis has said that the protection of children is a real priority for him. And as we've seen, and as Pope Francis has said, no one has done more than the Catholic Church in terms of instituting new child protection policies. The protocols are extensive, and they're now considered the gold standard with respect to child protection. You know, I have 5 kids in Catholic schools, and at these parochial schools, you can't get in the door without being fingerprinted and having your background checked, taking a class on child protection policies. And to just give you one example of how effective these new policies are, in recent years, in the New York public schools, there have been over 100 tragic cases of teachers sexually abusing children. In the New York Catholic schools, the Archdiocese Catholic schools, during the same time period, there were 0 cases of abuse.
There's great progress being made, but somehow when we get to this UN pounding of the Vatican, we don't hear anything about the progress. It's normally a look back to the way things used to be. Why don't you think we hear anything about what's being done and is done?
Well, it's very disingenuous what the UN is doing. They're deliberately ignoring all the progress that the Catholic Church has made in this regard. They're ignoring, too, it's very hypocritical. They ignore what's happening at the UN itself with respect to the sexual abuse of minors. There have been rampant reports of UN peacekeepers abusing children around the world. And the New York Times even accused them of sweeping it under the rug. So really, they should get their own house in order. And if they really cared about minors, they could look to the Catholic Church as an example of protocols which are really working and protecting our children.
And of course, Alan told us about the UN grilling of the Vatican about abuse and classifying it as torture. Both critics and defenders of the Vatican spoke in Geneva today, and here's what they said.
The types of action that would actually protect children would be if Pope Francis were to immediately remove all of those who have been credibly accused from ministry today. That would make children safer.
I think in this kind of situation, there will never be enough done. The church has invested $2.5 billion in compensation for the victims. And some of the abusive priests, most of the abusive priests that we know of have been defrocked. So there has been action.
Certainly, it's an issue that cannot be easily addressed, a very difficult situation for the church. How do you see the comments from both sides there?
Well, what's really happening at the UN is they are trying to use this as a club to silence the Catholic Church, to discredit the Catholic Church. It's truly outrageous, and it's very sad, really, because, of course, the Catholic Church around the world is the most ardent defender of human dignity and the precious nature of every human life. And in the Committee Against Torture, they've even gone so far as to equate being pro-life with being pro-torture, which I know that sounds absurd, but the vice chair of the committee describes herself as fiercely pro-choice. There's a real ideological agenda, and they are saying that it is torture to deny a woman abortion. They say it's psychological torture. So they literally are effectively anyway, equating being pro-life with being pro-torture. And again, it's the ideological agenda of the UN. They're seeking to silence and discredit the Catholic Church because of their own ideology.
Maureen, does the UN have any real authority here, or is this more of a show?
Of course they don't have any jurisdiction. The 1 square mile of the Vatican city-state, of course, is a member of the UN. But the 1 billion people in the mystical body of Christ, the spiritual body of the Catholic Church, the UN has no jurisdiction whatsoever. But that doesn't stop them from lecturing the Church, telling the Church to change its canon law with respect to its teachings, its beautiful teachings on sexuality and marriage. And that's what's really going on here. They're seeking to undermine the moral authority of the Catholic Church.
Do you think it'll work?
In the long run, we know it won't work.
Yeah. Maureen Ferguson with the Catholic Association. Thanks for being with us again.
It's great to be with you. Thanks.
Right. Well, Pope Francis made a visit to Poland's National Church in Rome Sunday. The Holy Father greeted members of St. Stanislaus, especially many children who were there for Mass. He celebrated a Mass of thanksgiving for the canonization of St. John Paul II, of course, a native of Poland. Pope Francis reflected on Sunday's Gospel, telling of Jesus' appearance to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. He recalled a saying of Pope St. John Paul II, quote, "We are pilgrims, not vagabonds." Well, we previewed the March for Life in Italy last week. This Sunday marked its 4th year, and it's growing. The event drew people from across Italy, Europe, and even as far away as the U.S. EWTN News Nightly spoke with some of the Americans who participated.
We're here representing our organization, Save the One. It's all people who were conceived in rape like us, or mothers who became pregnant by rape.
I hope the world understands that just because your conception might have happened from something bad, or in my case, my mother is schizophrenic, that just because she's mentally ill doesn't mean that my life doesn't have value and that I can't be productive and be a voice.
Pope Francis greeted the marchers at the close of his Sunday Angelus, or Regina Coeli address. He noted that this year the March for Life had an international and ecumenical character. The marchers passed by some of Rome's most iconic monuments, ending at St. Peter's Square. Up next, 2 astronauts inducted into the NASA Hall of Fame at Florida's Kennedy Space Center. And a new sporting craze is sweeping the UK, giving traditional football a run for its money. Thank you so much for joining us on this 5th day of May, a Monday. On EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick, and Target announcing today its CEO is out the door. President and CEO Greg Steinhoffel has taken the heat for Target's massive data breach last December that compromised 40 million of its clients' bank accounts. Since the disclosure, the company has lost business and started to work on new technologies to make checking out more secure. Meanwhile, Target is working to rebuild its reputation. Experts say it's the first time a CEO of a major corporation has resigned because of an information breach. Well, if you think your Samsung smartphone looks like your friend's iPhone, you're right. A California jury found today that Samsung copied some of Apple's smartphone features in a patent infringement. But the court also found that Apple had infringed on one of Samsung's products. The jury awarded Apple $119 million in damages, a fraction of the $2.2 billion that the company sought.
The jury did say, yep, Samsung did copy Apple's iPhone 4 and 5, but it really awarded it minimal amounts, believe it or not. $119 million is a minimal amount in this type of litigation.
Latest in the Samsung and Apple's competition to dominate the $330 billion smartphone industry. Those two companies together own almost 50% of the smartphone market shares. Now to Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 2 astronauts were newly inducted into the NASA Hall of Fame there this weekend. You can see some of the other Hall of Famers lined up with them for this wonderful ceremony. One of the honorees, Shannon Lucid, was part of the first NASA class that sent women into space. The other, Jerry Ross, got kudos for being the first person to be launched into space 7 times. Well, in sports, they say no pain, no gain. But a new sports craze in Europe could change that. Well, it might look like a friendly game of soccer, but a new sporting craze is sweeping the UK and giving traditional football a run for its money. Zorb football, a take on the conventional soccer match, has players suiting up in giant inflatable balls. Once the footballers master getting their uniform on, the Zorbs act as giant bumper balls as players crash into each other without getting hurt.
It's more about taking the opponent out, and if you score, it's a bonus.
As players knock their opponent down, it's not easy to get back up again, meaning less players to defend their goal. And Zorb developers say the twist on the old classic means much more fun on the pitch.
There's not many rules, so it's a bit better. It's a lot better, to be fair.
With its beginnings in Scandinavia, Zorb football tournaments are now taking place across the UK.
It's not even hit the surface yet, is it really? So as soon as you do more proper football tournaments and people get more involved, then that's when it will start getting bigger.
While Zorb football hasn't reached status worthy of a World Cup,
it's really, really fun. It's a good way of playing football, running into people, just having a good laugh, really.
Players find the game a fun spin on the original sport. We could use some of those around here. I love that. Not many rules. All right. Be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and catch us anytime you like on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you for watching tonight, and each night of the week, good night and God bless you.